Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, 13 of the most popular routers are vulnerable to attack. Is yours one of them? Tune in to find out. Plus details on the Malwarebytes update that rendered a lot of systems unbootable, a CISPA update, your questions, our answers, and much, much more on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 106 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly Systems Network and Administration podcast. We streamed this episode live on April 18th, 2013. This episode's brought to you by GoDaddy.com, and I'll tell you more about them as the show goes on, and by The Faux Show. Episode 137 features your TechSNAP 100 shirts. Go check out this week's Faux Show, and the live stream is powered by Scale Engine over at ScaleEngine.com. My name is Chris, and joining us every single week is the admin, the tech, and the teacher, Mr. Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Hey, man, and welcome, everybody, to episode 106, and welcome to our JBLive.tv chat room, who's joined us at this 1 p.m. Pacific. And that
4
is
p.m. Eastern, 2000 UTC.
What was the UTC?
2000.
Aha, that's
8
right.
8 p.m.
Yes.
UTC.
Alan, guess what? Huge show today. Big show. In fact, I would go so far to say is some shows might just take our first story this week and make it their entire show. Ridiculously as that might seem. And the roundup is ginormous. I know a lot of people who are watching right now, CISPA is probably on the tip of their tongue right now because it's just as we are starting this recording has passed the House. We're going to talk about that in the roundup as well as a few other really kind of important stories that have made it down there. So a ton to cover this weekend.
Yes.
So should we just jump right in?
Some stuff that might normally have been a full news story is just in the roundup because there's so much news story in the news already that it was
let's be honest, sometimes
there wasn't enough time.
You know, you have the leisure to pick the stories that you think are really interesting to dive into, and that's what we love to do at the top of the show.
Or also I start writing the show notes and then run out of time, so anything I didn't have time to finish writing notes about goes in the roundup.
That's called the rabbit hole effect. Yeah, you going down the rabbit hole of a story. All right, well, why don't we get started?
It's like, I've spent an hour on this story and written 2 pages of notes.
So this first story is sounds like it's one of these that affects people that have a lot of consumer-grade routers. Am I tracking?
Yes. So a research firm called ISE, Independent Security Evaluators, basically started doing a case study on basic, like your regular Soho home routers, right? The, Netgear, D-Link, Linksys, TP-Link, the ones you buy off the shelf at a big box store or whatever. Basically the ones that everyone has.
Yeah.
If you don't have this one, you definitely know at least 2 people who do have one of these specific models even. So they started with just like 10 of them, but as they kept researching, they ended up working on 13 of them specifically, and they found quite a few problems.
Surprise, surprise.
So they've released the first part of the report, and at this point, they have 17 confirmed CVE numbers. So those are, you probably noticed all the time when we talk about vulnerabilities, they normally have this unique identifier, CVE dash, the year dash, some numbers, and it explains what the vulnerability is. And the purpose behind those is just so that when multiple people are talking about the same problem, there's this one identifier that links all these things together. Right, so like when we talked previously about a problem with like Bind, the DNS server, that's in things like Red Hat and Ubuntu and Debian and 100 other products. And so if they each have their own vulnerability announcement for that, then it's hard to tie it all together and know whether it's the same problem or not. So that's what these CVE, or Common Vulnerability and Exposure, I think is what it stands for.
Right.
So these are these numbers that uniquely identify each problem. So basically, there are 17 confirmed problems, and those are addressed with the vendor. And then there are 21 more where they've requested a CVE number and it's still being processed.
So where does this leave us?
Basically, that leaves us with almost 40 unique vulnerabilities across these 13 routers.
Holy crap, Alan. Holy crap.
Not all of the information on all of the vulnerabilities is disclosed yet because the vendors haven't been contacted yet.
Right. So this is a good day to mention pfSense.
Yes, exactly.
Everybody remember Hey, everybody.
Yes, I'm glad I used pfSense.
Yeah, wow, it's incredible. So,
but also, just in the chat room, somebody was asking about setting up a little DNS zone for their home LAN. I'm like, if you had pfSense, you could just have it part of the DNS server that's in DNS.
Yeah.
And then just like, there's 100 things you can do if you have a real router. instead of one of these tiny little embedded thingies. But anyway, so they tested 13 different router models and found that every single one of them could be compromised if you were on the local LAN with it.
So you just need to be on the same LAN.
Yes, or wireless LAN. So if you have weak Wi-Fi, then they can get into that and then
or
take over
open
the router.
Wi-Fi. Yeah. I guess I suppose I sit here not actually too surprised when I think about it.
Well, especially just a lot of the people are probably going to have the default password, which is usually password or admin or the brand name.
Point. Ton of them are insecure by default, right? And then the other thing is a ton of them are running extremely old versions of embedded operating systems, be it Linux or something.
And not just that, but extremely old versions of the firmware. It's like the company releases new firmware, but 90% of the users don't know what firmware is or how to get it or that they should bother doing it.
Right. And then
there's always that risk of bricking it too. And you're like, I don't really need it.
It's almost the BIOS approach. If it's not broken, I'm not going to update it. And then the other problem you have is there's software that is incredibly high risk that just sits there and never getting updated. Like Apache's often on there for the web management, right? And maybe
although they usually use something smaller in the embedded ones.
Okay, but but it's the same problem, right? It just does. It's a web service that's listening to remote connections that's not getting patched.
Yep.
So I guess I'm not really too surprised in the context.
11 of the 13 could be taken over remotely if they had the remote administration option enabled. And 2 of those could be done even if there was no active management session on them.
That's lovely.
Half of the devices they tested that had a NAS capability, because a lot of these routers now have a NAS capability where they a file server for you as well.
Probably USB on there.
Yeah, half of the ones that have a NAS capability the NAS could be accessed remotely.
Oh, that's just your files.
The files on your local LAN could be accessed off the internet.
Yeah, it's just my personal files, just my private personal files.
And photos and documents and whatever else you decide to store on there.
My pirated
although
movies.
it's not enabled by default, if the remote management is enabled, a number of these routers can be compromised remotely. Some of them have authentication bypasses where you can do it without having to know the administrative username and password.
Right.
Some of them use what's called the cross-site request forgery. Basically, I can embed some JavaScript in a page that would submit a form to the router that would make it think you were doing it, right? So I could cause your browser to connect to the router and submit a form, say changing the admin password, because you had logged into the router previously.
Right. Oh my gosh.
Or so some of them didn't bother, if you got past the login page, you could access any of the URLs without logging in. Right? So the login page was only cosmetic, really.
Right.
If you just deep link to the settings pages, they would come up with no authentication. Or some of them would require the authentication, but because most of them are HTTP basic authentication, right? It pops up that login box instead of having a web-based thing with sessions and so on and cookies. That means that if you've logged into that, until you close your browser, you're still logged into that, right? Your browser remembers and will just provide the username and password with every request. So that means if I embed a link or a form into some page that your browser hits, then it can access that router. Right? We talked about that one like that before, where a guy was embedding a bunch of URLs with the default username and passwords embedded in the URL into emails and sending them to like iPads. Remember that? It was quite a while ago, but we talked about a similar approach. So someone could do that and inject this into a malicious page, and then your router is compromised.
That's the ability, where the login page is just essentially cosmetic, and you can deep link to the configuration pages. Probably not as common anymore, but I think what that is a symptom of is programming by the lowest bidder on some of these devices. So they're built by people that are really just not obviously very practiced in securing systems that are border systems. They're designing consumer systems that sit on borders of
also,
networks.
A lot of these systems have very, very little resources, right? You have like a very small footprint and a very small amount of RAM.
Tiny processor.
So you're cutting all these corners, and that's not what's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Huh. So what do we do?
And then the other thing is, once compromised, the attacker has remote control over your router, right? So whether it's them compromising it over your Wi-Fi by like word wrapping past your house or whatever, or if you've enabled the remote administration and they get into it remotely, or however they do it, once they have it, they have the ability to change the settings on your router, which doesn't seem like a huge problem, but it is.
Of course.
And the other thing they could do is overwrite the firmware on your router to do various different things.
Yeah.
So if an attacker can change the settings on your router, then the first thing they can do is change your DNS servers. Instead of using the ones issued by your ISP, which is what most all of them would do, instead they would change it to point to their evil DNS servers. The problem with evil DNS servers is when you try to go to, say, Facebook, when you look that up, instead of getting the real IP of Facebook, you get the IP of the evil server.
Right.
Now, the evil server can now perform a man-in-the-middle on you. So when you're trying to go to Facebook, you're actually going to the evil server.
Right.
And then the evil server goes out to Facebook and does the request on your behalf.
You know, I've done this. This is when the client comes to me and says, we'd like to block social network. And I say, okay, here's your 3 options. The cheap option is we just change it in DNS so it just points to one of our own servers and says, corporate policies. And then, filtering options. And almost everybody always goes with the DNS approach. So I essentially do this not as a man-in-the-middle attack, but just to curb social network traffic.
Right, so there's that, but basically they pass their traffic through, so you actually end up getting to Facebook
of course
through the evil server. Now, that means they can read all the traffic going back and forth, including your username and password, unless they're encrypted. So, places like Facebook purposely use SSL for the login part. Of course, a lot of these sites have even transitioned to use SSL for everything, but originally, like Hotmail back in the 2000 through 2010 anyway, would use HTTPS only for the login portion. And so what would happen there is it would switch up to SSL, log you in, and then switch back to not SSL. So what the man-in-the-middle attack server can do is use a program like SSL strip. And basically what it does is it doesn't tell your computer that the site offers SSL. Right? So when the Facebook login page comes up and it tries to send you over SSL, the evil server strips out the SSL part and makes you submit normally and then passes the page to you. So you submit normally to the evil server, and then the evil server connects to Facebook over SSL, right? Because they've already seen your traffic. They can send it encrypted beyond that. So Facebook doesn't know that you're not using SSL, and your computer doesn't realize that you're supposed to be using SSL. And now the evil people have your username and password for Facebook or
whatever.
Your bank.
Right.
Or your PayPal account or whatever else you were doing.
PayPal's got to be one you'd go after because tons of people use it. It's easy to predict. Man.
Darren Guy, I'm getting to HSTS.
So chat room's getting on you about it.
So Facebook uses SSL, and that's right. So a new browser system called HSTS, or HTTP Strict Transport Security, is basically a header that websites can send to the browsers saying this site will always have SSL. And if it doesn't, something fishy is going on here. And basically that header says this site will always have SSL, and you can believe that for the next X, where it's like, say, 30 days or something like that. Sites like Facebook probably have that set much higher, but anyway. And that little TTL means the browser will remember that this site will always have SSL for the next whatever amount of time, say 30 days. And no, Internet Explorer 6 does not support that. It's a question in the chat. And with that time to live of 30 days, now every time the browser sees that, it refreshes that. So if you go back the next day, it's going to bump back up to 30 days, not keep counting down. And basically that's there so that the site could eventually turn it off if they didn't want to. Rodzone, well, what if I'm doing it on, say, my little domain here, and then I let that domain expire, and someone else registers it and doesn't want to use SSL, right? So that's why there's it's so that there's some way to turn it off eventually. That's why there's a TTL. Anyway, the problem with HSTS is that if your browser has never been to the website before, say Facebook, right? If you've never gone to Facebook before this man-in-the-middle attack was intercepting and removing the HSTS header, then you don't know that Facebook is supposed to have SSL, right? So some sites, some browsers like Firefox are working on seeding a list into the browser of sites that so that, on a fresh install, your browser already knows a list of sites that have HSTS. But, at some point, how big does the site have to be to get on this special list, right?
Yeah.
And so, it doesn't seem very scalable. Like Google and Chrome can hard code that Google will always have HSTS, but, how do you get on Google's list of blessed sites that are pre-stocked with HSTS or whatever? So HSTS helps if you've been to the site before and then you start getting man-in-the-middle attacked. But if the man-in-the-middle attack happens before you've ever been to the site, then it doesn't work. Also, if you switch browsers or get a fresh profile or something, it might not remember the HSTS is up before. And the other problem is users, right? A user gets a warning about this and they don't know what it is. Whatever, I need to do my online banking. Let me in. Right?
Yeah, just click OK.
Yeah. If the attacker has full control over your router, then they can also overwrite the firmware with their own maliciously crafted firmware. So one thing they could do is, once they install their firmware doesn't allow you to do any further firmware updates. Right? So they could basically freeze your router with the vulnerable version so that you can't upgrade it to fix it.
Right. You're stuck.
Yep. And in that case, or they could brick it, right? They could purposely write invalid firmware so that your router wouldn't boot and basically brick the router and you'd have to physically replace it. The other thing they could do is make a custom firmware that goes on your router and could do additional types of traffic interception or manipulation. They could block your access to certain sites, right? So make it so that through your router, you can never access Windows Update or Ubuntu Update, and no more Java updates or Flash updates for you. That way your computer remains vulnerable, right? Or they could inject malware into legitimate websites and downloads, right? They could say, hey, every time you pull up Google, I'm going to inject this bit of malware in the bottom of the page. So you're on a trusted site, but it's being, through the man-in-the-middle attack, I can inject malicious code into it.
Right.
Or every time you download an executable file, I can, append a virus onto the executable.
Yeah, one that I saw, I came to somebody's machine who had malware on there, and it had replaced their DNS servers. And what it would do is, every time they would go to google.com or bing.com or yahoo.com and search, it was actually sending them to their own lookalike site that was displaying all kinds of crazy ads. Like if you search for Trend Micro House Call while you were going to one of their crazy sites, you would get just the most junkiest crapware that would just load the system up with a ton of bogus crap. And they all had this stuff preloaded in there. I've also seen it where they'll do it on the specific antivirus website's domain. So you say you go to a standard Google search and you get the results and you click it, and then as it goes to load trendmicro.com or housecall.com, whatever it is, then it sends you to their bogus sites, and it's just like right out from underneath you. And average users have no idea anything's happening at all.
And then they whip out their credit card and fork out the $70 that random crapware site wants.
Right.
And then you just paid $70 for more viruses instead of for an antivirus.
Right. Yeah, messing with DNS is such a tricky thing because it's so hard for anyone but really an expert, and I'm saying anybody in our audience qualifies as an expert in this regard, to identify it.
And that's why there's this system called DNSSEC, which basically allows you to cryptographically sign DNS responses so they can't be modified, but it doesn't always solve all the problems.
Right.
So yeah, the biggest concern is the fact that these routers will never be updated until they're replaced. So the researchers have some advice for the router vendors to make these type of problems easier to fix in the future and to prevent some of them and things like that.
Okay.
They want firmware to be digitally signed. Right,
that
way
makes sense.
Fake firmware can't get loaded.
Yeah.
Right, and that way, the router will only accept firmware that is legitimate. The problem with that, the downside to that, is that it may cause problems for projects like DDWRT, where you want to replace the firmware on your Linksys router with community firmware.
It will, yeah.
So, while it seems like a good idea, it might not be.
I didn't think about that. I guess, and maybe if you could have here's a crazy idea. If only there was some way to put dip switches on the back. Now, I know, hang in here with me, but if we could somehow have dip switches or jumpers and I could just switch on or switch off if I need to have a signed BIOS. It's crazy, I know. If only we had the technology.
Yeah. There's other ways they could do it.
Yeah.
Too. But yeah, that might make sense.
I just wanted to reach out to the nostalgic in the audience and do a little chest bump with them.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any other thoughts on that story?
And jumpers.
I know, right? Hey, man, I dip switches. Do you remember? I used to have to set my SCSI ID because remember you could only have what was it originally 8 or 9 SCSI devices?
0 through 7.
0 to 7. Yeah,
8
and of course.
Total.
And of course, the host has to be 1, and don't forget your terminator at the end of the SCSI chain, and set your ID correctly with the good times. Alan, any other thoughts on that story?
Oh, lots.
Okay, wow, just getting started. All right.
Design an automated update system for routers so that users that are not savvy enough to update their firmware, the router updates the firmware.
Okay. We've talked about that.
Yeah, even if users are savvy enough, there's no mechanism to notify the users that there is an update. Right? It's not a software running on their computer. It's not like Flash or Java where it can annoy you to update it.
Right.
It's your router. So you don't know that Netgear has come up with an update. And so you don't update it, and then it's vulnerable, right? So some type of automatic update system, although they, in the report, and I strongly agree, that there should be an opt-out option for users that want to disable automatic updates and maybe do it themselves.
Then I'd feel better about it.
Yes.
Especially, because sometimes you have situations where there are quote-unquote consumer-grade routers that are used by the enterprise, maybe at like a CEO's house or a staff member's house, and you still want to have change control over those devices, even if they are consumer devices.
Yeah, and lots of other reasons. And, you just might not want it reporting back or whatever. And things like that.
Maybe you're a paranoid SOB.
Yeah, exactly. But on top of all that, make sure all requests actually validate the HTTP authentication data. Right, so no more of these authentication bypasses, right? You have to check that my login's valid on every request.
Yeah, you shouldn't be able to do that at all for no reason.
Yes. And also implement tokens in HTML forms so that there's basically a random token that gets submitted with each form, and if it's not there or not right, then the form submission gets rejected. And that would prevent the cross-site request forgery. That would prevent malicious code on a website somewhere from using my browser to reconfigure my router. Right? Because you don't want to do it. So, and then they have a bunch of useful tips if you're just the administrator who's stuck dealing with these Soho routers. Right? So, first thing is never enable the remote administration options. Right? Don't expose these never updated, horribly old devices to the internet. Right, that's a good start.
A couple of people
it's off by default, but some people do enable it, and it's a really bad idea.
A couple of people in the chat room are pointing out right now is companies like I have several Linksys. I have a Netgear, and I have Linksys that I've bought for family members that they just don't issue updates for anymore. They're still using them. They'll probably still use them for a few more years. In
the report about one of the ones, I forget which brand it was, but they said there's a firmware update on their website, but it appears to be for a different model number. So you look up your router, it says there's an update. You download the update, it appears to be for a different model, and your router will not accept the update because it's not for the right model.
Yeah. Maybe we have to have install days where we just go around and replace the router firmware on people's computers, routers.
Yeah. So upgrade the firmware regularly because that helps. Don't enable network services you don't need, even on the LAN side of the network, right? You don't want Telnet on, you don't need FTP or SMB, and if you're not using it, turn off UPnP. Right? If you're using it, then you can, you weigh the risk. But if you're not using it, it should be off.
Right.
When you do have to log in and administer the router, when you're done, log out from the router and then restart the router. That way, you're sure the router doesn't remember you're logged in. Right? That way, it's fresh every time. Right? So after you log in and administer the router, you should restart it.
Thankfully, I have one of those great routers where if you even look at it sideways, you have to reboot for anything to happen. So every time I go in there, I have to restart the dang thing.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Also, when you're done, clear your browser cookies and any active logins after you log out. A handy tip here is only log into your router while in private browsing mode in your browser. That way, when you stop private browsing mode, it gets rid of any cookies or session data that were from your router there.
Oh.
It's not just for porn.
That's nice and paranoid. I like it.
Yes. Also, they recommend using a non-standard IP range on your LAN side. Like, they don't mean using something outside the regular RFC 1918.
Right.
It just means instead of the standard 192, 168, 0 dot something or 1
Right.
dot something,
Yeah.
use something else, like
Get crazy with the
192.168.13.
I always go tens.
Yeah, I use 10s as well, but using 192.168.13.0.
Yeah.
That way, it prevents the common attacks, right? Like we talked about the one with the strings and the emails, right? If a lot of these viruses are just going to go after, there's the two most common subnets, is .0 and .1, right? With the standard passwords. So if you just move yourself off of that, then they're not going to find your router, and they're just going to assume you're not vulnerable, even maybe if you were.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to be able to look for your router all over the place. No. The other thing is my routers aren't on my router isn't usually the .1 address. Partly because it goes back to when I first had a network, when I still had dial-up. My computer was the .1.
Yeah, of course.
And so my computer has always stayed as the .1. So the router can't be the .1. So the router ends up in some other place.
254?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Although it's 249, actually.
Tricky.
There's a long explanation for it, but anyway. Migrations and, yeah. Anyway, if you use a slightly different IP range, then it helps ensure that, untargeted attack isn't going to pick up on your router. If your router's administrative interface supports HTTPS SSL, you should enable that. Although not very many of the commercial grade ones do.
No.
Mostly because they're not going to have a legitimate certificate, and the scary message is going to confuse users. Some of them will allow you to provide your own certificate, so you'd have to either pay for a certificate, which is probably a waste, or do a self-signed certificate and install it and trust it. But, it gets cumbersome. Only install firmware from the router manufacturer's website, right? I've seen people do it before. They go and they search Google for the firmware, and they get the firmware or a driver for some piece of hardware or something from some random site on the internet that has like driver.com in like something drivers.com or something.
What could go wrong?
Those sites, half of those sites are malicious, or they're just sucking up ad money. Either way, go to the manufacturer to get the driver.
Don't do it.
Or the firmware.
Yeah.
And lastly, choose a strong administrative password that's at least 12 characters. That's a lot, but it's,
But they're using LastPass anyway, so they can save it.
Yeah. And, if you're that hard up for it, write it down and sticker it to the bottom of the router or something. That way, if you forget it or someone else needs to admin the router, they can find it. But without physical access, nobody's screwing with your router. And then CNET had an interview with the researchers, and they have some Q&A type stuff.
A great write-up on CNET's part, actually.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's, yeah.
So essentially...
Anyway, in the details there, they have a list of some of the routers and so on. Essentially,
what probably anybody who's kind of thought about the out-of-date software on there, the low wages the people paid to make it, and the tight margins these manufacturers have, we've all kind of sat here and thought, God, I bet that's just a big box of vulnerabilities sitting on my network. And it's true, is what you're telling us.
Yeah, and basically, security researchers hadn't really gone after it before because it wasn't a juicy enough target. But now it's like, oh, yeah, we've kind of been ignoring that, haven't we?
Well, there's just so many things in the market now that have been out for a few years that have network connectivity that are running very, very old embedded operating systems. This is this is going to be a big problem.
Related from one of the stories on this particular story, one of the websites I was reading, they end up going to Rapid7's Metasploit page, and they were talking about, originally Metasploit didn't cover, consumer electronics type stuff, but now they're starting to, because they've even found, I think it was a Netgear VoIP handset that they could hack because of vulnerability in the software.
Wow.
Right? So it looks like a phone, but it has a full operating system in it, and it's compromisable.
It's just ridiculous. We are living in a crazy transitional period where people have more ability to deploy software than they have to manage that software. And
well, it's more that before you had computers, and then you had electronics, and now everything's a computer.
Right, and and everything has to have a full operating system, and has to have a whole network stack and services. Alan, any other thoughts on that story?
No. That's
all right.
2 pages of notes. There's lots more in my write-up, and then there's 10 times as much in the write-up of the researchers.
I want to point people, go find episode 106 on the Jupiter Broadcasting website, and go take a look at those notes. Alan has everything he just covered documented there. If you heard him mention something and you want to go links. Check it, lots of stuff there. Just go right there. Just find the 106, scroll down past the video, boom, show notes, all there for you. All right, Alan, let's take a quick second and thank this week's sponsor, GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy.com, longtime sponsors of the TechSNAP program, the world's #1 domain name registrar, the one that Alan and I prefer to work with because they are the gold standard in the industry. And, you know, we have a great code right now. If you use the code GO35OFF4, you can go grab some GoDaddy hosting for 35% off if it's your first purchase or any other. 35, just take 35 off whatever you're doing over there if you use the code GO35OFF4. 35% right off the top. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. GoDaddy is taking it right off the top. And they also have those great SSL certificates, which are, of course, trusted everywhere, accepted everywhere. SSL certificates are accepted and for a great price, especially when you use Go35OFF4. But maybe you want to get yourself a .com when you're over at GoDaddy. You can also
the SSL certificates are so cheap. You could buy one for your router.
That's true. That's true. But if you don't, maybe you don't need a cert. Maybe you want the .com because we got a great code for the .com. I think it's going to end at the end of the month, so go use it now. Tech295. Hurry up! Hurry up! Tech295 when you check out.
Get a .com for your router too.
Yeah. Get your router hooked up. Put some PF.
I was talking to somebody in the chat room about creating a little fake DNS zone for their homeland, but for $2.95 you could buy a real .com and use it for your homeland.
So here's what people need to do. You either take your existing router and put like something like Tomato or DDWRT on there, or get yourself a PF box and go over to GoDaddy and get yourself hooked up with all the goodies. Get your .com and your SSLs and use our code TECH295 to get that .com or Go35OFF4.
A PF with an SSL certificate and your own .com for your internal LAN. That'd be sweet.
Hey man. That's how you got to roll these days. So thanks to GoDaddy for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. All right, Alan. So why don't we move on? There's a program that I use almost on a weekly basis at least. That's Malwarebytes. Tons of times when somebody gets infected with something and it's looking pretty bad, I almost always turn to Malwarebytes is almost always one of my go-tos. So I'm sure this story is nothing but good news, right?
Not quite. So the antivirus vendor Malwarebytes issued a definition update for the software, like they do all the time. Like it's basically the main thing that they do. But it turns out that definition mistakenly identified some legitimate Windows system files as trojan.downloader.ed.
Oh, no good.
So the offending update was v 2013.04.15.12. And it was on their website for about 8 minutes before they pulled it down.
Oh, okay.
But in that time, a few thousand people got it.
Yeah.
And it deleted some Windows DLLs and stuff and made a bit of a mess.
I mean,
they have a false positive fixing tool that will fix your computer. It's details on their forums, and they have the steps. Depending whether you can still boot your computer or not, they have all the steps, and they provide support via email and telephone to help you get it sorted if you're having issues.
So it's actually rendering the systems unbootable in some circumstances?
In some circumstances.
Boy, last
week, if you delete certain files. Although it seems weird because Windows System File Protection is supposed to prevent the system from being immobilized.
Remember we talked about that Microsoft patch last week in the roundup that was in Brazil?
Was killing Brazil, yes.
It's been a bad week, a couple of weeks. And, you know, this is almost a rite of passage sometimes for some of these malware authors.
Well, exactly. This is not the first antivirus vendor to have this mistake. In fact, I can't think of any major vendor that hasn't done this before.
Right. I mean, think about what they're doing, right? I mean, think about what a anti-malware program is actually doing on a Windows box. It's pretty invasive stuff. It's kind of ridiculous that they just have carte blanche access to the file system, and any system file they want, they can just nuke. I mean, that's about as bad as the malware itself. Only it's from the good guys, supposedly. But if they screw up...
Right, and so it's a constant battle to ensure users are protected against the latest threat, right? So they're trying to get these updates out as fast as possible. So when they shave that margin between when they discover the problem and when they push the update, it means that there's that much less time for testing and so on.
Right. So had they... I mean, they're going to have to address the testing process. Obviously, something failed there.
Yeah. So they're... I think on their blog, they talk a little bit about how they're going to beef up their process.
Good. I've used it a lot.
They proposed to enact some new protocols to ensure updates get more thoroughly tested and some peer review and things like that.
I followed this program for years now, and it's really gotten a good name for itself now.
Yes, actually, I did a very small amount of consulting for them one time.
Oh, really? Can you say
a friend of mine had written the PHP code that used to run their website for their virus database. So when it told you that this file was infected with virus blah, you could click on the name and find out what that virus was. And they needed some updates to it, and my friend wasn't available to do it, so I did it. It was quite a few years ago. It was like 7 or 8 years ago now. So it's obviously been replaced by now, but I did a little bit of work one time.
Any other thoughts on that story?
No. They have a blog post where they talk about it, and there's a bunch of information on their forums for fixing it and all that stuff.
I mean, they got the bogus update pulled down pretty quick.
Really quick. Like, I figured it would take a couple of minutes to pull it down. So that means they must have figured out something was wrong, like, immediately.
I wonder if they started updating their own systems, like, they were like, oh, crap. All right, well, I feel like it's been a long time since I've had my Chinese hacker story fixed. Can you accommodate me on this?
Sure. Yeah. So Kaspersky Labs has the story of Winnti.
Winnti?
Which is, basically what they've labeled a group of hackers specifically going after online video games.
Oh, okay.
So they've just published results of their 18-month investigation into ongoing attacks against online game publishers and their users.
Wow.
So the investigation started 18 months ago. So that's the autumn of 2011.
Yeah.
When a huge number of computers were found to be infected with the exact same malware. And when they started looking at it, they found that the common thread between all of those computers was that they were players of a specific online game from a publisher in Japan.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
So, at first, people thought that it was the publisher trying to spy on their users. But it was later determined that the malware was installed on the user's computer as part of a legitimate update for the game. Right? So when a game was patching, it was also downloading malware. Right? So originally, people suspected it was the game company installing this malware. Detect cheating or something. But it was quickly determined that what had happened is that the update server had been hacked, and this virus had been included as part of the game update. It basically used as a trusted conduit to deliver the virus to the users. So the video game publisher called Kaspersky and asked them to investigate the Trojans that they found on the update server. And when Kaspersky was updating the Trojan that was used on the update server, they discovered that in addition to the Trojan, it had a rootkit that had a properly signed driver for Windows 64-bit. So normally, the whole point of driver signing in Windows 64-bit is not allow any driver to load if it's not digitally signed, so that a virus can't inject a rootkit.
Yeah.
But this rootkit was digitally signed with a valid signature. This is where things get interesting. The digital signature that was used belonged to a different game publisher, KOG from South Korea. Turns out KOG had been compromised and had their certificate stolen. So Kaspersky notified KOG and VeriSign, which is who issued KOG their certificate, and they had that certificate revoked to hopefully prevent that from happening again.
Wow.
But as the investigation progressed, Kaspersky found that the Winnti group had in fact managed to compromise dozens of different game companies and has a whole slew of these certificates that they could use to legitimately sign software.
Wow. I mean, so they're like targeting players of games. And this is like
the game
their whole
companies
thing.
themselves.
This is like their whole thing is they figure out what game companies to go after, where they're vulnerable, and then they go after the players. What? I mean, is the end goal to generate and spam gold in game or?
Different things. So the Winnti group also appears to have sold access to those stolen certificates to other attackers.
Sure.
One of those stolen code signing certificates was used in an attack against Tibetan activists.
That's interesting.
That's obviously has relations to China. But the attackers had 3 different ways to monetize their attacks, to make money off of these attacks that they were doing. The first was the unfair accumulation of in-game currency or gold, right?
That's what came to my mind.
Which they could then sell in the game or through various websites or whatever.
Right.
Now, sometimes what they would do was actually they compromise the game server and actually put a virus on one game server that would change the execution of the actual game on the publisher servers to basically open up an exploit for them to just go and, hold a bag under a fountain and get free gold, basically.
Yeah. Jeez.
So instead of just, like the typical image of gold farming is, like a sweatshop full of people playing the game and accumulating the gold. But these guys were basically hacking the game server to make it just give them gold that they could then use to sell for real money. The second one was stealing the source code from the online games in order to find more vulnerabilities in order to steal more gold. And the third one was to steal the entire source code for the server part of the game and then run pirate servers and then charge money for that. So instead of, this game costs like $15 a month subscription or whatever, but if you just pay us $10, you can play on our server forever. Because we stole the source code for the entire server.
That is, this brings Chinese gold farmers the efforts to, very sophisticated.
Yes.
Imagine what lengths these guys are going to go to get Bitcoins. Wow.
And then on top of the giant write-up there, they also have an analysis of the older version of Winnti, because it basically has gotten a lot more sophisticated over time. And then they have a PDF that's about 95 pages of even more technical detail. So it's just a lot.
I love it. This is the kind of stuff where you got to, if you really want to know how these guys do this, like if this is an industry you're trying to get into, the security analysis and vulnerability reporting, this is worth your time to check it out.
Even if you're just, as like a hobbyist, you just interesting read, it's really worth it.
Wow. So there you go. That's the big business of video games. We don't even realize it's going on. There's like this whole subculture out there for that in-game currency stuff.
Yep.
Going to the trouble of setting up, I like the idea too of, we'll just rip off the server and then we'll just cut out the middleman and just charge them directly. And so instead of it's just totally just knocking off the company's original game. But I guess what do you expect?
With the full source code too,
I've heard there's fake World of Warcraft servers out there. So I don't know. I've never got on one.
Yep.
But all right, Mr. Jude. Well, I think we're almost done with the news. Before we go on, I just wanted to remind folks that Jupiter Broadcasting has an affiliate program, which we have linked at the bottom of our website. And if you click one of these links before you shop, a portion of your shopping session is contributed to Jupiter Broadcasting without costing you anything more. We can do it down there for Amazon and eBay and Netflix and Newegg and ThinkGeek and Best Buy. We have browser extensions for Chrome and Firefox. Now, here's the thing. I just wanted to mention this really quick. We were checking this out on the pre-show. ThinkGeek is having free shipping on all orders over $75. That's not too tough to hit the $75 mark on ThinkGeek.
No, I've done it almost every time.
Yep. And so say if you're buying something like the Star Trek electronic door chime, which has a motion sensor, if you use the link at the bottom of our website first.
Every time somebody goes to the door, it can make the swoosh or the red alert sound.
Yeah, and both out. I think that's awesome.
Yes.
So if you want to grab that or anything else over at ThinkGeek while they're having their free shipping sale, don't forget to use the link at the bottom of our website first, and then a portion of your shopping session will support the Jupiter Broadcasting Network. All right, Mr. Jude, well, I think the news is all done, right?
Yep.
All right, then you know what that means. There's nothing. If there's no news, I got, let's see, nope, nothing over here. Nothing. Oh, no, that means it's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com or popping that contact link at the top of the Jupiter Broadcasting website, or, like our first question this week, starting a thread in our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv. Mr. Jude, why don't I start with our first question this week? It comes from Monster Cameron on our subreddit. And he's asking about payment processing for WordPress sites. He says, I'm trying to get my stock photo site off the ground, but I need a payment system, and I was hoping for any ideas that are cheap and would work with PHP and integrate with WordPress. And this is something I don't think we've rarely ever talked about on the show before, is payment processing. So do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I've never actually used any out-of-the-box software to run e-commerce. There's a bunch of different things. There's lots of things for WordPress and so on.
Yeah.
Personally, for e-commerce, I use Stripe.com, which is a credit card processing system. And I've also used PayPal.
Yeah.
It's PayPal. Everybody uses
Amazon
it. But,
has a payment system too. I would say those are your top, for a WordPress site, I think those are your top
if
three.
if you're any kind of developer, Stripe is definitely the best. They have an API that's just amazing. Like I'm rewriting my API to be like theirs. I love it so much.
No, Stripe is. I hear a lot of good things,
Yes.
and there are a ton of WordPress plugins that integrate with Stripe.
Yeah, they have like a directory or something. I think of things like that at Stripe. And PayPal is hugely popular. There's lots of things like that.
Yeah.
And Google has Google Checkout, although that doesn't work in very many countries. Stripe is US, Canada, and UK only, I think, at this point. But it's growing. They're adding more countries as quickly as they can. So even if they don't do your country, if you're interested, you should tell them, and they will keep going.
Totes. All right, our next question comes from Spinny, and he wants to know what happened. He says, hi, Chris and Ellen. Great show. A while ago, you guys suggest smoke ping as a way to know when there was an abnormal network event, and it works quite well. But how do I find out what happened after I noticed there was an event? He says, like if I'm away from keyboard or something like that. My firewalls run OpenBSD, and I could log every PF rule and then sed, awk, and Perl to try to figure out what had happened from that fire hose. But is there something like NTOP that's connected to a database that can replay what happened? Thanks, Spinny.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. I run Nagios, which is using ping or smoke ping, and then basically what it does is graph everything.
Yeah.
So a graph can help you visualize the change over time. It's like, oh, look, at this time, the latency jumped by this much and then went back, or packet loss went this or that.
And the other thing is it's also watching your other hosts, so you can correlate that event to
so
a
it's
host.
like, oh, look, I see from this machine to these 3 machines there was a problem, but to these 5 other machines there wasn't. Or, this machine saw a packet loss to every host on the network, but from everywhere else, the packet loss was only to that host. So the problem was only that one host or whatever.
So what about part of the problem is he needs insight, and you almost need something like a central syslog server too. So that way, he sounds like he doesn't want to go through the log, but if you set things up right in syslog, you can have only the errors, they only write to a certain file, or critical events only write to a certain file. Then you could just go check that critical event file, right?
Yep. And then another thing you can do is what's called network flow analysis.
Yeah.
Where it actually looks at the different, like it understands layer 4, like TCP and stuff, and can help, detect when things are abnormal. And my friend and fellow BSD person, Michael Lucas, wrote a book about doing network flow analysis. So I have a link in the show notes to that.
Oh, okay.
It's quite useful.
Nice.
Something I would like to get around to reading, just don't have time yet.
Yeah. When maybe one of these, maybe you should go on a boat one of these days and just read some books.
Read.
Yeah. All right, now we got a PostgreSQL question that we'll try to give a stab at here. It says, hi guys, love the show. 2 things. Thanks for the promo code. I signed up with GoDaddy just this month and used the code. I needed it for zytechhealth.com to point to another site that my wife and I use for affiliate sales. I must say it was it was pretty easy, and I have it running on a Raspberry Pi. Really? That's cool. It says I'd never done a domain before, and I was pleased with how easy it was. But here's the question. I heard that you use PostgreSQL, and as it's also my choice as a database for anything that I do at home, I was hoping for suggestions on best security practices. He knows about some of the crypt functions and things like that, but what else should he know? Thanks for the news, views, and reviews. So, securing Postgres, man, this is like a whole show. Like you could do a whole show on this particular topic, and there are some good videos online about it. I don't know if I have any major tips that jump out at me other than the one that is always, if you can do it, and it sounds like you might be able to because you're doing it from home, is only accept connections from localhost for Postgres. That's huge. And then use something like SSH tunneling if you want to connect to it and manage it from another box. Then you're going to limit the amount of remote connections, and you're going to essentially collapse the attack surface as much as possible. I don't know, Mike, is there any other kind of basics for Postgres we can just kind of name here? I've never used
Postgres, so I don't actually know.
Oh, okay. I thought you used it for a few scale engine things.
No, we use Percona, which is a MySQL fork.
Ah, look at you, Percona. That's right. I remember you talking about Percona. I recall. Yeah. All right, so maybe that'll get them started, and then people can always submit their suggestions.
But I'm sure the Postgres manual has a section on it somewhere.
Well, yeah, and there's
but I'm
tons
sure
of great
that
videos.
Dan Langill will yell at me. He runs the Postgres conference, which is the week after BSDCan in Ottawa. And,
hey, Jude. Hey.
well, sorry. If you want to know about Postgres security practices, your best bet is to go to PGCon.
Right, or look for videos from it after it's over.
That too, yep.
Yeah.
And
All
there's
right.
probably videos from last year, actually.
There you go. Mark writes in, he says, "Hi guys, I have a question regarding virtualization and would love it if you could talk about this on the show. Is there any way that a virus or any type of malicious code can bypass a virtual environment like VirtualBox or VMware and affect the host machine? Personally, I use VirtualBox on a Windows 7 machine, but it'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts on whether the security is affected by running another hosting environment like Mac OS and Linux, or if it's the same across the board. Best wishes from Belgium, Mark."
Yeah. So there have been what are called VM escapes before, a virus or something that managed to actually get out of VMware or VirtualBox or whatever.
From the guest
so yes.
onto the host?
Yes. They're quite rare, but they do happen. And if something is that sophisticated, it doesn't matter if you're running Windows, Mac, or Linux, that they probably
I know the one we covered before, there was one that affected Zen. It was like it's going to be very virtualizer specific, I would think.
Possibly, yes.
Unless it's exploiting a flaw in the CPU.
Right. So, yeah, there's a number of different ways it could happen. And so you can't trust that it would never happen, although it's fairly rare.
Very rare. And I think it would make news, too.
Yes. So you should just make sure that whatever virtualizer you're using is up to date, like Zen or VirtualBox or VMware or whatever. And
use different accounts on the different machines, so that way...
and you can usually, depending on the virtualizer, a lot of the times it doesn't necessarily need to be that privileged. But it depends what happens. But I wouldn't say you're any better off running it on a Mac or Linux than you are on Windows.
Probably not.
Although there are, performance things that you might have better performance for it running on top of Linux than Windows, but it's not the compelling reason to change.
And your likelihood of getting a drive-by rootkit or malware is higher on Windows.
Right. Most of these ones that escape the VMs are mostly specifically targeted at the researchers that are dissecting viruses.
Right.
Right. They're trying to, the virus. They know the virus is going to be running a VM, and they're purposely trying to break out of the VM to infect the researcher.
All right, Mr. Jude. Our next question
or like the Zen one was designed to get to the host and then be able to sneak into the other virtual machines.
Yeah.
Running it. So, if you attack like a virtual server provider, a VPS provider, then you could break into the other virtual machines that were on the same physical machine as you.
But you could literally take an infected Zen guest and do the conversion and move it over to VMware, and it would not affect the VMware host. So it was very specific. So it's a pretty minimal risk, but it is a risk. It's enough of a risk.
But everything is a risk. Plugging your computer in is a risk. So
it's enough of a risk where I would say don't run your firewall and your other important data systems on the same virtual host if you can avoid it. You know what I mean? Like if you're really worried about it, it is better to put them on separate physical hosts. But if it ever happens to you, write into the show. We could get a scoop. All right. The last question of the day, because then we have a massive roundup to get to, comes from Chimoko. Chamako? He says, "Hey, Alan and Chris, still loving the show and thought I'd throw a PF Sense question at you." Right on, man. Recently, I signed up for a VPN provider that I'd like to automatically route certain traffic through it. I use PF Sense now as my gateway and was wondering how reliable/easy it would be for me to route, say, BitTorrent traffic, so that way I don't get throttled for downloading Linux ISOs, and traffic from certain machines on the network with static IPs. I know that besides just direct P2P traffic, DNS or other tracker communications might slip through. So what precautions could someone take, and how can you verify that it's actually working? Thanks, and keep up the great work.
If you want to route all the traffic from a specific host through it, it's fairly easy, right? You just use the VPN endpoint as the default gateway or something to that effect.
Right, but then all traffic from that host is going to
all
go
traffic from a host through the VPN is, it's just a matter of setting the default gateway on the host that you want to use a specific place as the route. Now, to do just BitTorrent traffic off your machine, that's a lot more complicated because you can't necessarily easily tell what is BitTorrent traffic, right? Like you said, like the DNS, even if you say, all right, all traffic that is to or from this port on my machine, which is my BitTorrent port, should go this way. Writing rules like that is fairly hard, but even if you had that, the problem is the DNS request would go through, and there's no way to necessarily tell they're related. So unless you can do something...
So you might have to, if you had local DNS, that would prevent the DNS lookups from going... Partly, well, not always, no.
Unless you made all of them, but basically, if you can get... basically, there's applications that will use to launch other applications, and they cause all the traffic to be encapsulated and go through a specific way. Or the easiest way would be run your torrent client in virtualization and have that virtual machine route all of its traffic.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, use VirtualBox or use VMware. They're free, and you just toss it on there. You put the VM in there, and you set that VM's default gateway to the VPN. Yeah. And then everything that happens in there
on that host is going through the VPN. Yeah,
and then you just minimize it, and you go about using the other PC. Just like I think that's your safest bet, right? If you're really worried about it.
If you're using VirtualBox or whatever, you can have the what are they called? Where the folders in the virtual machine and on the physical host.
Oh yeah,
so
the shared folders thing.
Yeah, you can even have it write the Linux ISO to your physical machine, so that you have that file still and everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all right. So there you go.
That would be the easiest.
That's a great question, though. I'm sure that's something that crosses people's minds.
Basically, to do what you're talking about, like fairly deep packet inspection, and you're never going to be 100% sure you tagged all the traffic.
If you're totally worried about like leaking and giving indications of what you might be doing on the internet when you're getting your Linux ISOs, then you should just go the virtualization route. All right, so we're going to cut off the emails there, but we got more, so we'll try to double down on it next week. But you can still send yours in. Email the show, techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com, or hit the contact link, or start a thread over in the subreddit, links.techsnap.tv. We love getting your IT support questions, sysadmin contemplations, security best practices, and everything else. Just send it in to us, and we'll cover it on a future show. But with all the feedback done, that means it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. Welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are stories that didn't quite fit at the very top of our show. We still want to talk about them, give you a few links to follow up on your own after the show, and a lot of these links are provided by our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv. All right, Alan. The first Roundup stories got me a little upset, a little grumpy. CISPA has passed the House, and it is now on its way to the Senate, where it'll obviously be rubber stamped, and then it's off to Obama's desk. Here's what I love, though. There's some really juicy quotes to pull from, but maybe my favorite here comes from Representative Mike McCall, a Republican from Texas. He went as far as to urge the passage by comparing it to the Boston Marathon bombings that happened this week. In the case of Boston, they were real bombs. In the case, we're preventing digital bombs, and these digital bombs are on their way. Our nation is under attack.
Right. Says a guy that doesn't know anything about the internet. Anyway.
Yeah. So there you go. We've talked about CISPA quite a bit, so if you wanted to know more about it, you probably should just catch some back episodes of both TechSNAP and Unfilter, really. I try to, even in the last, I try to give as much awareness to this as possible, but obviously we have a limited platform here, and there's, and the real difference...
I'm Canadian.
And the real difference is there's been some amendments that don't really address the issues that most of us actually care about, like the privacy problems. And the secondary problem now is this has serious corporate backing. Twitter, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, IBM has gone as far as they've actually sent squads of lobbyists to DC to push this forward. Not only do they stand to make a ton of money.
I saw a story. My business partner linked me a story a couple days ago. Of the IBM putting together these squads, and he's like, that should be illegal.
Yeah, well, so not only do they make a ton of money from the implementation contracts they'll get for designing the systems, which they are also actively campaigning on, but they're going to save a ton of money from the in the courts, because remember, part of CISPA indemnifies them for providing more information or exposing customers, aka users, aka us, exposing something they shouldn't have exposed by providing information to the government. They're indemnified from any type of actions that I as a citizen could take. So that's going to save them a ton of money in the court. So it's a real win-win for the companies and for the government. A lot of people think this trashes Fourth Amendment rights, and I'm pretty concerned about it myself. But I'd say this thing's greased lightning at this point. I mean, maybe I'm being pessimistic. Maybe it'll get to Obama's desk and he'll veto it. He has said that he intends to. However, it's sort of been a weak threat, and he also said that about a few other very important things that have passed.
Right. Yeah, he says, I'll veto it if you don't fix it. And then
they fixed
the definition of fix is anything.
Yeah, exactly. They fixed it.
Fixing a period that wasn't in the right place.
So the part that is really concerning about where CISPA's at right now is a lot of the massaging that happened inside a committee that was opaque. It was not opened up to the public, and there were amendments that were suggested that completely rectified the privacy concerns. I mean, completely took care of them. Still made them very reasonable. Still made it very effective legislation, but took care of the privacy issues, and those were wholly rejected. So I think it's pretty clear what the intent is, and it's unfortunate. And CISPA's on its way. There's a petition that the ACLU and other groups are trying to get together on right now, but we'll see. All right. Should we move on to the next story in the roundup?
Yes. So interesting story here. Sky, which is a UK ISP, caused headaches for a lot of their users when they migrated from Google to Yahoo for their email. During the migration, it seems Yahoo lost some of the metadata, specifically whether an email was marked as read or not. So all of a sudden, your entire back catalog of all the email you have, which, especially with Gmail, where you normally don't get rid of anything, means that all your email shows up as unread.
Oh, man.
Google claims that in the data export that they sent, it had the metadata, and Yahoo just didn't import it properly. But Sky's recommendation was that people just mark their email as read. It's like, that wouldn't work well for someone like me who uses the read or not read flag to determine if something what the email is asking for has been done yet.
Right, exactly. Yep, that's how
it would cause
my crude system as well.
It would cause me horrible problems if my read or not read flag got lost.
I would just use that as an excuse to declare email bankruptcy. I mean, I swear I'm 2 seconds away from doing that anyway, so this would just be it. That'd push me over.
Luckily, on my mail server, the red flag is part of the file name. So when you mark a file as read, it gets renamed.
Oh, yeah.
And so that way, that data can't get lost somehow. It's not in a database somewhere or something. It's literally part of the name of each email.
Gotta love Sky.
The
cutting edge of consumer services migrating from Google
to Yahoo. I'm guessing that had to do with some amount of money being given to them by Yahoo.
Maybe they just like Marissa. Maybe they're just big Marissa fans.
Anyway, Tech Week Europe has a write-up about that if you want more details, or if you want to poke fun at them or whatever.
This is something
I used, for my mail server, people in the chat room were asking, I used Postfix as the mail server and Dovecot for IMAP, and then all the email is stored in Maildir, which is a standard.
This is something we laugh at, but really when you're using a hosted service, something like this can just happen.
Yep.
Just something I'm aware of.
I also use XIM as a mail server on a lot of my production stuff as well, though.
Yeah, I use that mostly on Debian.
I'm more familiar with XIM, but my business partner did our corporate email setup, and he's more familiar with Postfix. So we're using Postfix.
In my opinion...
And it's Dovecot 2, the newer one.
I like XIM the most myself, just for as a quick little mail server. Just a quick
one. Well, I've been using DirectAdmin for so long, and that's what it comes with, and so I've just got really good at it. So I've always liked using it, but...
I got my start. I think it was Debian's mail server choice for ages. Next story on the roundup is one that kind of implies. Also, I'd love to see action like this when it comes to these routers, but the ACLU is asking the FTC to force carriers to patch or replace old Android devices.
Yeah. So basically, older versions of Android have vulnerabilities. And when your your phone carrier decides they're not going to let you upgrade from 2.x to 4 or whatever, or even the latest 2 point whatever.
40% are still on gingerbread.
Yeah, and it means that your phone is vulnerable to a bunch of exploits.
Yeah.
And your phone company mostly is not letting you update because they want you to just buy a new phone.
Right.
There's no other reason why they're not letting you update.
Yeah, so you're walking around with a vulnerable software stack and a vulnerable Linux operating system, and by the way, it's connected to the internet all the time. And it's also got a Wi-Fi antenna on it. It's constantly looking to connect to networks. And it's got Bluetooth. And so, no big deal, right? No big deal. It's just the most connected device we've ever created. And now it's running 2-year-old versions of software. Not a big deal, though. So crazy. So good for the ACLU.
Yes.
Now go after routers. And we'll all be happy.
Well, see, the difference is the router, they can't force an update the same.
Yeah, no way carriers are going to replace handsets either. And see, the problem is they can't just flash them to the latest Android either because of the hardware requirements. Those old phones can't run that.
Right. So, but there are security branches of the latest 2 point whatever, whatever version of Gingerbread your phone is on. There's a security branch that contains the fixes.
Yeah.
Or it's up to the phone companies to make it. Right.
Yeah.
It's their job.
Yeah. Exactly. The code's open. Go code it.
Yeah.
So this hit me earlier this. Maybe it's a new anniversary, or maybe it's just like a birthday celebration. It hit me earlier this week, but Google Apps was down, hit with a partial outage on Gmail, Google Docs, and the admin control panel.
It's back up today.
Yeah. Yeah, it happened while I was working on Unfilter yesterday.
Yes.
And like you pointed out during the pre-show, is that this actually happened the same day last year.
Yes. So on April 17th, which was yesterday, Google Apps was down. That meant Gmail, Google Docs, Google Drive, Google Spreadsheet, a bunch of other things. And the hardest hit was actually their control panel that you use if you're using a lot of Google Apps, like for your own domain and stuff.
Yep.
And now they don't offer a free tier for that anymore. So almost everyone who's using that is paying for it or is a legacy user. But it was interesting in, writing the article about it. It turns out that on exactly the same day last year, Google had an outage of Google Docs. If it had been like the time zone, the daylight savings change day, or April Fool's Day, or a leap day, or something, that would have, kind of made sense. But I don't know what's special about April 17th, or if it's just a coincidence that it happens every year on the date.
I got an interesting one for you in the roundup now, Alan. So this was stories coming out from Linode. As a precautionary message, procedure, they've reset users' passwords. Now, Linode's sort of like a go spin up a VPS real quick service. They've had some security problems in the past. Here's the interesting thing. They're claiming at this point they haven't been hacked. The attacker... They
just detected some unusual activity and blocked it, yes.
Well, and the attacker's saying, there's a guy, he went out and he posted, oh, no, I got in. I totally got in. I used this vulnerability on Cold Fusion and I got in. But Linode's like, our logs don't show he got in, but they're resetting passwords anyways.
And then he has a pastebin showing him doing like LS on their document root and showing files that just like everybody else in Linode's document root, there's a bunch of random files that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Like a README file for AMI BIOS.
Really?
And stuff. And things like their Google domain verification file, which is like Google _random string of letters. And basically enough stuff to prove that that's an actual view of their actual document root.
Oh, now they're saying the group did get access. Yeah, they are saying that on their blog now. Okay.
Well, basically, the contention of the hacker is that he told Linode about it more than 2 weeks ago and came to an agreement with them where he wouldn't release the data and then they weren't going to tell their customers. And then at some point, Linode contacted law enforcement and that violated the agreement with the hacker. And so the hacker is now planning to release all of the data, which apparently includes customers' information, their hash passwords, and encrypted credit card numbers. The problem with the encryption on the credit card numbers is that the public and private keys for the encryption were on the web server. So he has the keys and can decrypt the credit cards.
Oh, geez. Are you serious?
These are what he claims. We don't know necessarily any of this is true.
Right. Got to keep that in mind.
But the biggest mess in it seems to be that it may have happened that Linode was trying to keep this under wraps and it is going to blow up in their face.
Yeah.
But again, we don't know anything for sure, and that's why it's not in the top of the news.
But I want to put out there, it's a pretty popular VPS provider, so if you guys out there have any systems out there, now you know what's going on, and it's probably worth checking into.
If you had an account and reset your password, you want to make sure you keep an eye on your credit card as well.
Okay, WordPress admins, now it's your turn. WordPress sites are under a wide-scale brute force attack.
Apparently WordPress installs at a number of really large web hosting providers, including GoDaddy, HostGator,
Liquid Web,
Melbourne IT, a bunch of other places. They're noticing huge numbers of attempts to log into the WordPress admin area using the username admin and random passwords. And it's just like 90,000 unique IP addresses pounding away constantly to the point where it's actually causing some sites to be so slow that the site won't load.
Yeah.
And cause especially customers that have a lot of WordPress blogs hosted on a virtual machine where they're actually exhausting all the resources of the machine trying to crack into the WordPress admin. So they have some steps there that you might be able to take to add additional security and block the attacks.
But probably a good opportunity here to remind everybody, update your WordPress, install WordPress is one of those where it offers a lot of great features. The downside is you need to stay
because
current.
It's so popular, and it's open source. People are always trying to find ways to break into it.
Also, no reason to use admin as your admin user. Maybe change that to something else.
Don't have a user with a common username.
And make sure you're using good, secure passwords. All right, this one...
Rawzone, a firewall that checks for headers isn't really going to help protect your WordPress, is the problem. But anyway.
All right. Now, this next story kind of, I don't know, anonymous, one part of me fears because of who knows what's going on there, but the other part of me is always kind of taken aback and smiles a little bit at what they're up to. Anonymous has raised $54,000 through an Indiegogo Kickstarter to have their own dedicated news site for your non-news.
The funny thing is that originally they planned to raise $2,000.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, they went all out, man. They made a video. Now, of course, Your Anon News is all over Twitter. I actually follow them. Oh, wow. According to them, FBI.gov is down right now. Wow. See, this is what's great about Anon News. So they're starting their own news site, and I don't know. They raised $57,000. Here's the question. How are they going to get that money without somebody tracing it back to them?
Yep.
How are they going to get that money from Indiegogo? I don't know. FBI.gov looks up to me. I don't have any problems with it. Oh, Anon News. Okay, Alan, should we talk?
It's not loading for me.
Oh, really?
Interestingly. But FBI.gov is on Akamai, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah, it looks like a few people in
nodes
the chat
of it are all over the place. So it basically, if it's down, it'd be localized.
See, I'm trying to reopen again. Yeah, see, it's loading for me, okay. But yeah, the chat room says it's down. I guess just, like you said.
FBI.gov has a different DNS than www.fbi.gov.
Oh, take out the www?
Sorry, it wasn't working for me without the www because that's apparently not on the CDN.
Gotcha. Well, Alan. All right, why don't we talk about Intel's new Atom chips that maybe we'll see in servers? Is that what they're trying to tell us? Are they trying to convince me to put an Atom in my server?
They have some of that, but I was actually talking about their new E3s, E5s, and E7s.
Oh, okay.
Xeons.
All right. Now this I'm into.
Yes, the new E3s have the lowest power ones have a 13-watt TDP.
Whoa.
Which is a big savings. And also the new E3s have enhanced video encoding. So if you're doing transcoding or editing a video or anything like that, especially server side, it's much better than the older E3s. The new E5s look pretty nice as well. And they introduced E7, which they hadn't had before. This is a new tier. The new E7s can support up to 1.5 terabytes of RAM per socket.
Oh.
Meaning an 8-socket server could have 12 terabytes of RAM. Or a standard 2-socket server could have 3 terabytes of RAM.
Jeez Louise. I want 3 terabytes of RAM so bad. I don't even need 12 terabytes. 3 terabytes and I'm happy.
Well, I might use a significant amount of RAM like that in a new build because it might be time for a 5th ZFS server.
Whoa, look at you go.
Well, we have a customer that wants more data than will fit on any one of our ZFS servers. Yeah. So it seems like an excuse to build a new ZFS server that holds like 36 drives or something.
So this will be the E7 family, the Ivy Bridge-EX generation that does 12 terabytes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Alan.
Whereas the E5 is the Ivy Bridge-EP.
I wonder how long until some of the software, like the Flash media encoding software, like Wowza and stuff, is updated to support some of the integrated video.
Intel promised their video encoding SDK for Linux and Windows sometime this year.
Okay. So, do you run Wowza on Linux boxes?
I run Wowza on FreeBSD.
Oh, okay.
It's Java.
Yeah. All right. Now, you had a little warning here, just kind of like, hey, you know how a lot of us like to look up how-tos online and then copy the command and paste it into the terminal?
Yes. So how often are you, when you're, following a how-to guide or whatever on how to do something on Linux or
real quick, I'll just copy paste.
Line, you can just copy and paste commands. This website shows a nifty little JavaScript hack you can do. I've noticed a certain CMS that a lot of news organization uses.
Yes.
When you copy text from them and you paste it, it adds, and read the rest of the story here.
Super annoying.
Well, the guy used basically the same mechanism to make it, instead of just doing the git clone that you want it to do, it actually echoes a bunch of nasty things to your screen.
Yeah, so
as an example, but it could also delete all your files or whatever.
If people are watching the video version, I just copied from the web page there, and I will paste it into this text editor, and you can see there's a ton of extra junk. And he formatted it so that it would it would do things on the command line. So this is kind of his point here. It's like,
then he tried to write a little ZSH script setting thing to make ZFS immune to this, and then they ended up finding a workaround for it. And so there's a bunch of more information about that on the post.
Very sneaky. All right, there you go.
And after some research, he also realized he wasn't the first person to realize this.
Well, yeah.
But so I found it interesting, and I imagine some of you will too. And I know a lot of people in the chat room are following random guides all the time.
It's not just the chat room, Alan.
You know.
Especially
anybody that watches TechSNAP and especially the Linux Action Show has probably followed some guide off some wiki somewhere at some point and copy and pasted some commands.
Yep. Oh, yeah, for sure.
So you got to be careful with that.
There we go. That's the roundup, right?
Yep.
Boom. So we've got links to all that stuff. If you want to read any of those stories in more detail, just go to TechSNAP 106. Scroll down to the bottom, and the roundup links are all at the bottom of the show notes. All right, Mr. Jude. Well, thanks for the great show.
Yep.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks to the jblive.tv chat room for not only joining us on this 1 p.m. Pacific, which is
4 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. UTC.
Wow. You just used the... Wow, okay.
Yes, instead of the 2000.
Yeah. And then you can join us. People. And not only do you get to throw random questions at Alan's face during the show that he'll just spontaneously answer mid-sentence, but you also get to help us name the show, which is cool. If you ever wonder where some of our titles come from, we have a voting system that's based on suggestions from the chat room, and when you join us in that chat room, you get to help name the show. So, all right, it's always fun. But, of course, TechSNAP's available for download later on Thursday evenings, Friday mornings over at jupiterbroadcasting.com. All right, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in this week's episode of the TechSNAP program. We'll see you right back here next week.